Managing risks is one of the main tasks the RMF was put in place to do. This module will talk about the introduction to risk management, providing a high-level overview of what risk management is and the basic steps we do to manage risks in information systems and common control sets. In this module, we'll introduce the concept of risk management. This module will not make you a risk expert, but really just introduce the concepts of risk management for your understanding. So as we move through the RMF, you understand the goals of risk management. So the basic formula for risk is this: a threat plus a vulnerability equals a risk. So without either of the threat or the vulnerability, a risk can't exist. But we continue to monitor threats and vulnerabilities to determine if this combination exists and if there's risks we need to worry about, mitigate, and correct. So in our graphic here, we have a unpatched vulnerability on a computer, on this laptop. So that's the vulnerability. The threat is the active hacker who's trying to exploit that vulnerability. The combination of those two create the risk. If there's a vulnerability but no one to exploit it, then there, in essence, is no risk. And if there's someone trying to exploit a vulnerability but the vulnerability does not exist, then there's no risk. Generally, in the RMF, we use this three-tiered organization-wide risk management strategy where risks are managed at each of the three levels. But NIST Special Publication 839 goes into a greater bit of detail defining exactly how to manage risk. And that's the high-level concepts we'll cover in this topic. Special Publication 839, Enterprise Risk Management, uses this four-step process to manage risk, where we frame risk, assess risk, respond to risk, and monitor risk. And these activities are all interrelated. It's important to define some basic terms before we move on. Inherent risk, for example. Inherent risk in risk management is an assessed level of raw or untreated risk that is the natural level of risk inherent to a process or activity without doing anything to reduce the likelihood or mitigate the severity of the mishap or the amount of risk before the application of the risk reduction efforts of controls. So essentially, this is the risk that exists before we put mitigating controls or compensating controls or privacy controls or security controls in place to reduce that risk. So we're never going to get rid of risk, but we're going to reduce risk to an acceptable level. So the inherent risk is the risk level we're starting with before we apply our safeguards or controls. Residual risk, on the other hand, is that amount of risk that's left over after we implement those controls. And again, the residual risk is the amount of risk or danger associated with an action or event remaining after natural or inherent risks have been reduced by risk controls. And the formula for this is inherent risk minus the impact of the controls equals residual risk. So we're going to try to use controls and safeguards to drive down the risk level of a risk. So if we have that situation where there is a vulnerability on a laptop and there is an attacker trying to exploit that vulnerability, we can reduce that risk by patching the system or putting firewalls between the attacker and the system. A number of different ways to reduce that risk to where this residual or remaining risk is at an acceptable level. So now let's look at the four-step process that's laid out by NIST Special Publication 839. The first step, as we talked about, is risk framing. And risk framing is the set of assumptions, constraints, risk tolerances, and priorities or trade-offs that shape an organization's approach for managing risk. Risk framing is informed by the organizational governance structure, financial posture, legal and regulatory environment, investment strategy, culture, and trust relationships established within and among organizations. Input to the risk framing step include laws, policies, directives, regulations, contractual relationships, financial limitations, which pose constraints on the potential risk decisions by the organizations. And that's some examples. So in this risk framing, we set what the requirements are for the organization. Are there certain laws we have to comply with? Are there contractual relationships we have to comply with? Are there things that we have to do when we manage risk that can't be mitigated away, that we can't just not do? The next step, step 2, is assessing risk. Risk assessment identifies, prioritizes, and estimates risk to an organizational operations, that is the missions, functions, image, and reputation. Risk to organizational assets, individuals, other organizations, and the nation that result from the operation and use of information systems. Risk assessment uses the result of threat and vulnerability assessments to identify and evaluate risk in terms of likelihood of occurrence and potential adverse impact, that is the magnitude of harm that can come should that risk be realized. And that's to organizational assets, the organization itself, and individuals. So in this step, we're really looking at where the risks are in the organization. What things pose risks? And to do this, we look at those things. Where are vulnerabilities? Can those vulnerabilities be exploited? Those are the basic premise of what we're looking for when we assess risk. We can use vulnerability assessments. That's either automated tools to look for vulnerabilities that are inherent in our information systems, or manual assessments by individuals that look for vulnerabilities. The third step is responding to risk now that we've identified it. Risk response identifies, evaluates, decides on, and implements appropriate courses of action to accept, avoid, mitigate, share, or transfer risks to organizational operations and assets, individuals, other organizations, the nation, resulting from the operation and use of information systems. Identifying and analyzing courses of action or alternative courses of action typically occurs at Tier 1 and 2. That's the higher levels in the organization. Normally that doesn't happen at the information system level, due to the fact that alternative courses of action, potential risk responses, are evaluated in terms of anticipated organization-wide impacts and the ability of the organization to continue to successfully carry out organizational missions and business functions. And that's why we determine these things at Tier 1 and Tier 2. Normally in the risk management framework, we're going to see the authorizing official and supporting individuals or roles determine if a risk should be accepted. That is, we let the system go forward with those risks. Avoided, maybe we don't approve the system to go forward. Mitigated, which means we put controls in place, whether they're direct controls or mitigating controls. Share the risk, that's where we share it with other individuals, or transfer the risk, and that's something like insurance. So these decisions are made at normally higher levels in the organization, where those risks can be looked at the organizational level and not the system level. Decisions to employ risk response measures organization-wide are typically made at Tier 1. That's normally where we see the authorizing official. Although decisions are informed by risk-related information from the lower tiers. Of course, Tier 2 and Tier 3 provide information to organizational leaderships to make these risk-based decisions. At Tier 2, alternative courses of action are evaluated in terms of anticipated impacts on organizational mission or business functions and the associated mission and business processes supporting the mission or business functions and related requirements. At Tier 3, alternative courses of action tend to be evaluated in terms of the system development lifecycle or maximum amount of time available for implementing the selected courses of action. The final step in our process is step 4, or monitoring this risk. And that's where we track the risks, and normally this is done in some type of risk tracker to determine if that risk is elevating or increasing in its potential impact to the organization, or it's receding or reducing in its impact to the organization. So risk monitoring provides organizations with the means to verify compliance, ensure that we're doing the right thing, determining the ongoing effectiveness of the risk response measures, and identifying risk impacting changes to organizational information systems and environments of operation. Analyzing monitoring results gives organizations the capability to maintain awareness of the risks being incurred, highlighting the need to revisit other steps in the risk management process and initiate process improvement activities as needed. Organizations employ risk monitoring tools, techniques, and procedures to increase risk awareness, helping senior leaders and executives develop a better understanding of the ongoing risk to organizational operations and assets, individuals, other organizations, and the nation. Organizations can implement risk monitoring at any of the risk management tiers with different objectives and utility of the information produced. That means we can use this 4-step process at all 3 tiers. In closing, in this topic, we covered organization-wide risk management, the basic risk calculation, the definition of the term residual risk, and then the 4 steps of the risk management process outlined in NIST Special Publication 839, and that is risk framing, risk assessment, responding to risk, and risk monitoring. If you want to understand more about this process, NIST Special Publication 839 is available in the reference section of this topic and also available at the NIST website. If you don't understand the basic points detailed on this slide, I suggest you go back and watch the video again, and we'll see you in the next topic.